I'd like to introduce you to my fellow panelists. On my left is Michelle Foss. Michelle is a fellow in Energy, Minerals, and Materials at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Then we have Florence Drummond, and Florence is the executive chair for the Development Partner Institute and the founder of Indigenous Women in Mining in West Australia. And further down next to Florence, we have Robin Armstrong, who's the mining sector leader of the Department of Earth Sciences at the Natural History Museum based in London, although it is a global institution. So I would like to start off this panel with you panelists to give me your top myths that you think the mining industry needs to debunk. Can I start with you, Michelle?
Okay. To wrap it all up into one myth, the biggest mythology in all of this is that we actually know what we're doing in this thing that we call energy transition, what direction we're going to go, what's going to work, what technology people want, what energy choices out there, and what this will mean actually for the mining industry coming in. And the biggest part of the mythology, the thing that we're working the hardest to deal with right now, is the affordability issue, which is a social contract problem in my view. The belief is that what we're pursuing, wind, solar, batteries, all of these things, electrification, that we can actually do this and have it be cost effective all the way through the life cycle, full cost when it's used. And what we're finding is that that's not the case. This is very expensive, what we're doing. And so the social contract implications back to the ultimate investors, the taxpayers in the United States, who are, for instance, putting up trillions of dollars for the IRA, it's a pretty fragile thing right now.
Florence?
Definitely. Well, for me, I would say what Michelle just touched on briefly, to say that it's too expensive to facilitate multi-stakeholder dialogue pre-project. It's too expensive to invest in that.
Robin?
That we think that we can even define what the social contract is. Where is it? Yeah. So that we actually think we know how to define the social contract. As large as that issue is, that social contract changes at different scales within society, so from the communities who are directly impacted all the way up to the nation state, if we like. And that's one of the biggest challenges for us going forward, is how do we make it equitable for everyone?
Can I just check that everybody can hear? Yeah? Okay, good, thank you. Perfect. Well, can I pick up on that point, Robin, and just get you to, expand a little bit further? So if you're saying that one of the myths is that we don't really know how to define the social contract, how would you define this, a social contract? Because social contract is something that we're all talking about all the time. It's, we're all talking about the social license to operate, but what does that even mean? Does the industry know what that means? Do communities know what that means? Do governments know what that means? What does that contract mean to you? How would you define that contract?
But now you really put me on the spot in terms of actually having to answer the question. And part of that is, I don't think we have the metrics to understand how that operates across all those different scales. So it's like a buzzword that we throw out. This is a social contract. It changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It depends on the style of government. It depends on how people are represented within that community, etc. So there's a big kind of sociological question behind all of that. And the fact is that we think that we can sit in an office somewhere in London, for example, and we know what the social contract looks like, for example, for Saudi Arabia. So we have to have that flexibility in understanding how it jurisdictionally changes and how it changes in terms of scale. So what it is how do we represent ourselves to the peoples, and how do the peoples represent themselves to us? So it's a question of representation and dialogue between both the industry and those communities or jurisdictions which are affected.
I think that's a really important point because you've picked upon that lack of homogeneity, and I think that maybe one of the challenges that the industry is facing is trying to figure out a homogeneous social license to operate that is going to work across the world, across every commodity, across every community, and that's just not, it hasn't worked, and it's not likely to work because everybody is different. I note that a couple of people in the plenary session have quoted the ICMM's research about saying that that the mining industry is the least trusted industry, or the least liked industry out of all the industry that they tested. And then when I'm talking to some people in mining, in Chile, for example, they're saying, well, that's not our reality. Our reality is that mining is very trusted. It's probably the second or the third trusted industry in Chile. Australia's got a different level of trust as well. So I think to your point about that lack of homogeneity is really important. The world is not homogeneous. And just coming to you, Florence, because your on-the-ground experience in Australia with local communities, you have seen there's a lack, there's different communities are expecting different things at different times in different areas, even within one country, right?
Absolutely. And so to Robin's point as well, there is so much complexity to do with communities. But I think when you said about our metrics, so that's one of the things I truly value about the organization which I represent today, is that we really did establish a framework over a decade ago that can speak, it's a principles-based framework, and that's something that we're activating even more now and into the future, and digitalizing that tool so that we can start to have that metrics baseline so we can report on as well. And this thing is applicable globally as well. So it is a tool that we can certainly start on and invest in, because like I said before, my myth was that multi-stakeholder dialogue is too expensive.
Yeah.
Well, having everyone at the table at the very beginning really does reduce that cost when things start to fall pear-shaped, or when we have these misunderstandings throughout the medium or the long term of the project. And we do have a few active cases right now, as we all know, and I think in our history as well, something we should learn from is that with having that multi-stakeholder dialogue and that investment at that very early stage can really reduce the impact and increase sustainability for the project.
Michelle, when you're thinking about social contract, what does it mean to you? How would you define it?
Well, I think there are layers, and that's the problem. The big layer that I talked about is the expectation, the idea that it's affordable. So a social contract with the voters is that we're going to roll out very aggressive programs. We can do it. We can domesticate supply chains. This is our thing in the United States right now, and to a large extent in Europe as well. We can execute. We're going to create jobs. We're going to create benefits, all of that sort of stuff. It's highly speculative. So you've got that. That sets expectations at the local level. So now you're going out and trying to do multi-stakeholder dialogue within this context of very, a set of speculative positions by investors, by companies, by governments, and so on. And that drives the tenor of conversations and influences how the social contract evolves at that stage. Then you've got, to your point, the social license to operate, the ultimate thing. How is the company going to execute? Will it be able to execute? Will it be able to develop viable and long-term, long-lasting relations with the local host communities? If you start wrong at the top, it's not going to work at the bottom. And we've seen this in just very, around hard-earned lessons in the past, and just in our country, but in other countries, where you go through investment cycles and you see how this plays out over the course of the cycle. At the end, you can't even tell whether at the social level you're better off. That's not a good way to end up at all. And I'm really concerned that we're going in that direction again. So what's the question? what's the premise? Does the premise make sense? If the premise makes sense, then you've got a top-level social contract with your voters, your investors that everybody understands. That can get translated down to the multiple stakeholders as you go into the next level, the local level, and ultimately to your operating level, I think. And I don't think we're there.
So we're not there yet. We know what's not working. You've just described that really well. What do you think is working? Do you think that, have you seen in your time in the industry improvements over time?
I think companies are more sensitive. I think there are a lot of groups like Florence's out there that have developed a lot of skill in helping to foster dialogues and all of that. I don't think that, I think one of the biggest problems is the retention of corporate knowledge, if you want to call it that. What happened before? I'm talking about cycles that happen over periods of a decade or 2 decades. Who's left behind to remember what happened, what went right, what went wrong? We generally tend to lose that capacity, so that when everybody is coming back around again, you have to start all over. I mean, that's the usual problem. I have to say that in 30 years of messing around with this, I haven't really seen good results, unless you're in a situation where you're in a rarefied location where the project is really well understood. It's a long-lasting project, and you've got a recognition of it at the local level for economic gains that's very clear, and that's a handful of situations.
Okay. So Florence, I'm going to come to you, and then Robin, I'd like to come to you just about, the best way to build trust, up with communities is actual engagement. And I just wonder, and this is, I think, just to pull on the string that Michelle just finished with, how have you seen? Michelle hasn't seen huge improvements in her career. We know what the problem is. We know what we're facing. We're also, by the way, facing quite a big macro challenge, which is that nobody trusts any institution anymore. And with the advent of deep fakes, people don't even trust what they see anymore. So how do you engage? How do you advise your companies that you work with to engage at the ground level, because that's where it all has to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to Michelle's point as well, I do think there has been some improvement, particularly in the women's space, in the gender space, and also in the Indigenous community space as well. I think people within industry are now more active to do one thing within their role, one thing within their organization, because this is a big burden. This is a big question, a big problem that we've had for a very long time. But I think for me, as an Indigenous woman from Australia, we've been very active, or we have organizations that are very active in creating pathways for people who are in these minority communities, who are part of the communities in which these companies operate. So I think that active role of pathways of local people being decision makers, I think that's definitely helping. We're seeing that shift a little bit more, which is very healthy. Definitely around technology and globalization and us communicating more with each other. I think we're exchanging those ideas of what does work globally. And that's what I really also value about DPI as well, is that creating this global network for everyone to connect in a safe space where we all know that we don't do things right all the time, and we've got a history of correction. But I think having the same people, or the same people behind the organizations with strong right direction values can really help move the dial for everyone into the future. So that's what I would say does work.
And Robin, just picking up Florence's point about knowledge sharing, the Natural History Museum is very good at putting itself in that position of facilitating that sharing of knowledge. How important do you think that is in the social contract, or change, or just even sort of moving the dial from a perception point of view?
You mentioned it right at the beginning, is that the mining industry has a poor reputation. And we can debate endlessly whether or not that is founded in truth or founded in it. And one of the first things we have to turn around and say is that we have to be honest about our mistakes in the past. a bit like museums have had to be for
Yeah.
various reasons. And that part of that is then listening to those communities. On a larger basis, one of the biggest issues we have in terms of how the industry is perceived is people don't understand the industry. You know, we can talk around, a good analogy would be, in many countries now, people go into a supermarket and they buy their meat on a piece of polystyrene wrapped in film, and it's completely divorced about what that actually means in terms where that product comes from. You know, my daughter's 6 and she looks at TikTok, and she tells me I'm a war criminal because I work in mining or whatever, and I'm saying to her, but how much energy are you using just looking at some cat dancing? Yeah? And there's a whole resource question around that. And we're starting to do it, but we haven't actually succeeded in allowing broader society to understand the impact of their consumption. And that's where places like the museum really come to the fore, is engaging people with what the natural world provides for us and what we can take from it and how much, what's the cost? What is the realistic cost about what we're doing? And that's not just about environmental damage, that's also about social cost. Because most of the time, if we build a mine, someone has to live next to it or will be living next to it. But someone in London, they're consuming all the time, they're not living on the edge of the mine. So it's that kind of, it's not just the responsibility of the mining, it's the responsibility of the miners, it's the responsibility of the broader society to understand where their consumption is and what does that mean. And that goes back to the original point about what is the cost. The cost is not just about, is it affordable, it's about the cost and the broader scope. Now, the other thing which we'd bring in here, and Florence and I have spoken a lot about this, is this idea is that we can talk about social capital and how that breaks into what the social agreement is, and then we have natural capital. In developed countries where we have urbanization, etc., we're so divorced about what the impacts of what we're doing are and what we want on this other thing, which is natural capital. Local communities, particularly indigenous peoples, those two things come together. They're on top of each other. They're not separate, they're together. And we need to understand that more as a kind of society about how do we use that to have that better idea of what do we want to do as a society going forward. And people have to listen.
I think that's right, and I think there's, probably 2 countries, Canada and Australia, that are starting to figure that out, and they are, the mining companies are engaging more closely to the Indigenous people than they ever have done before. Florence, I don't know if you would like to share any of your experiences working in Australia with respect to that engagement.
Yeah, definitely.
I think you made the point before about the importance of the importance of place and history.
Yes. Yeah, so there's definitely a lot more truth-telling around in the mining jurisdiction that is Australia. And our reconciliation action plans have helped us as well. So again, it's a toolkit that people can actually use, because don't forget as well, part of the thinking is that the social or the community engagement isn't core business to mining. So that's another myth as well. So I think having a framework there where people can work to and a tool that people can use helps it actually unpack the problem. So definitely in Australia you see that, and that's why we have the close kind of results that we also see with Canada as well, because we share the same similar histories as well, and similar attitudes, and I guess values and beliefs in moving forward, and what's important to keep at core and center when we're doing these engagements with operations and also with communities.
Thank you.
Can I ask y'all a question? I'm curious about this. Given our respective, experience on the panel, you're looking for solutions. You're trying to shape this social contract, at critical stages, right? Should you agree to provide a royalty directly to a community, especially if it's an indigenous community? What would you think about that as a solution?
I was going to say again, that's quite a global question, assuming that every answer with every community is going to be the same.
That's true. I'll take that. Taking that into account, I'm just curious in the situations that you've seen, would that be a solution in terms of?
I think it's a simple solution, but it's too transactional. I think people now are demanding more. Demanding more in the sense of expectations of we want sustainable partnership. not just a transaction.
Yeah. Any reactions on that?
I'm trying not to expose myself to my deep socialist values, but the point around that is that, in essence, a royalty for the community is a strong thing, but do you use a social bond as well as an environmental bond so that you can provide for that community post-closure? Because that's when the problems really start, when it doesn't come out.
Yeah, I mean, so the point is you're creating something locally that provides that post-project, it's a stability fund in some respects. The reason why I bring it up is because that line in the sand now exists. So we've been working on a project where that's been done to solve problems. It's bubbling around the industry. It's going to get looked at. And the reason why I wanted to pose the question is because I agree it's transactional. What I think that oftentimes gets missed in all of this is what will happen as you go through the phases of the project. What happens when the project is decommissioned? What happens when you're moving beyond that? And that's usually not something that we think very much about because it's far in the future and we don't really consider it.
I think there's also a bit of a fear of finding out with that answer. I think Florence has a view about that, is that companies don't want to ask certain questions because they're afraid of the answer. But if you don't ask the question and you don't engage in a dialogue with people, you're never really going to find out what they want, and therefore how do you ever negotiate or how do you ever bring them on the journey with you? But I agree, I totally agree, you're right with respect to often not communicating the entire life cycle of the asset. They only communicate the beginning bit because it sounds a little bit better. But I don't know, Florence, if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, definitely. I think, defining those components of what the value chain looks like, the life of the project, and what those steps are, and where we can participate in terms of communities, in terms of women. I think having that discussion through dialogue and deep dialogue as well, and coming up with an agreed action plan or agreed outcome, I believe that really does help to have everyone participate where they can, because it's not only just employment, you can build businesses as well. You see that happening in Australia. There's a lot of local businesses that are coming out of these regions that are very successful.
Yeah. I also think it goes to that trust question that you keep raising, trust in institutions. That so much of this happens at the sovereign level, right? So that's who you're dealing with a lot of times in the industry. That's who you're negotiating with. That is the first point of entry. And a lot of times, a lot of the social contract issues, to me, revolve around the lack of faith that the communities will benefit because the sovereign is the one that's driving the show. And I think that's changing, actually. I think we're in a time where, because of the conditions, why we're doing this, why we're talking about this, the importance of it, or the pressure on the industry, the pressure to invest and to expand, and all of those things is flipping the ledger a little bit. And I think that we're going to have to show that local groups, the host communities, the immediate communities can really benefit long term. And the question is, how on earth do you do that? What is it that you can really promise or indicate that will work and let you actually get to that point of being able to proceed?
Well, why don't we put that to the audience? Yes, if any of the audience has anything that they'd like to contribute or ask the panel, now is your chance. We have this gentleman with a microphone.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
The Feminist Party in Kiruna, northern Sweden, just tipped the balance to stop the greatest graphite mine. That would never happen in Newcastle 90 years ago, because it was a major employer and the community would never stop the exploitation. This is a change in the nature of social contract. And when we talk about social contract, it's not like the time of Jean-Jacques Rousseau when you're talking about legitimizing government. You're really talking about limiting free market. And the extent to which you should as Michelle said, at the different layers. Because you have to, they're completely different at the different layers. How you limit free market making the decisions is really becoming the issues. And as you said, it's a question of trust in institutions, because you need a lot of trust in those institutions to allow the social contract to limit free market.
I'll just make one very brief comment, and I take your point, and I agree with everything you said. I think the only thing, I would add to that is I think that people's wishes and desires have changed since the coal mining days in Newcastle as well. So it's not just about economics, and it's not just about jobs. It's about the softer things. People are looking for a better quality of life, or a better work environment, or more progression in their jobs, whatever it happens to be. But Michelle, why don't we just go down the line and pass comments on the gentleman's?
No, you're there.
Yeah,
Lawrence?
definitely. I would agree with what
I
he was saying.
agree.
Yeah.
As our resident UK representative?
I think, Carol, the comment you made, I think society's changed, expectation has changed. So there's a great book called Bowling Alone. I don't know if anyone's ever read it, about change in society through North America, much more individual, much more family units. It's not that community. And the point about mines in the past, particularly in the UK, entire communities grew up around those mines. There's culture grew up around those mines as well. Those mines closed, we lost it. The brass bands of the north of England, they were built within the mines and stuff like that. And for many communities, that's what they let us see the mine. It adds something to the community, adds something to the culture will develop around that. One of the analogies I would use, rightly or wrongly, is that in many ways for communities, mining is like the sports stars. They have a career and they can make lots of money potentially during that period. Well, that career comes to an end, right? And how many times do communities fail or fall apart because they're not planned for a knee injury in the third quarter or something? So there's an analogy there, and is whose responsibility is it to allow that planning section to take place? If we go back to the idea of a social bond, to allow that community to thrive beyond mine closure, or that country to thrive beyond the loss of a resource.
Well, if I could just, sorry to interrupt, to pick you up on your analogy, because like that career, this panel has come to an end, I'm afraid. Yeah. So thank you very much, panel members. Really interesting conversation. We never have enough time to have these conversations. So if you want to pick anything up with any of the panel members, please feel free to reach out. But please put your hands together to thank my panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.